Welcome to part two of our podcast talking with designer Max Dymond, who's working on a tabletop RPG system called Leviathan. This is going to be the finale of our discussions. We talked more about the tabletop game and more about tactical design and tactical strategy gameplay as well. You'll find a link to part one down below, and with that, we'll get back to the cast already in progress. And that actually takes me to another question I want to ask you about. With I was reading the itch page for Leviathan, and of course you have a very established and developed world and sort of go with things. In terms of building the game itself, how do you consider the world building and the lore when you're thinking about the decision making and the options you want to have in your game?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was designing, so this is one reason why I changed my positioning system, because I decided that a tactical grid didn't reflect how I imagined the space of Leviathan in my mind. Because I wear my influences on my sleeve with a lot of this stuff. I know that I'm not reinventing the wheel with a lot of this stuff. I'm just taking ideas that have interest to me in and creating something syncretic that kind of represents my interests and would hopefully appeal to someone like me. So a big influence on the world of Leviathan is a manga series called Blame, which is set in a place called the City, which is essentially this giant chaotic structure, which it's implied is about the size, its circumference is that of the solar system. It's just been built for thousands of years by mindless machines, and it's extending out almost infinitely in every direction. And the architecture of the place is completely insane. You've just got walkways suspended over chasms. You've got these bizarre kind of almost like homestead structures with doorways that don't go anywhere. You've got elevators that take 40 years to get from one place to another. And I felt that abstracting the space would make a lot more sense for that. And even just in the character generation, it's an accepted element of the setting that everyone is post-human. There aren't, you or I wouldn't be what you would meet if you were in this world. Everyone has some kind of mutation or some kind of cybernetic alteration, which is they've been infected by the megastructure and it's kind of taken over part of their body, or they've become psychically active. Or they're just a human alien hybrid. That is the baseline in Leviathan. So as a result, character building is very straightforward. You don't get to decide what your innate abilities are because you're the descendant of 1,000 generations of post-human mutants. So you just roll two traits, stick them together. That's you.
And it also kind of goes with what we were talking about in terms of how much preparation that can go into games like this. And I guess there's another point about that. For a lot of the kind of more Hilltop-inspired CRPGs, they will often go with throwing tons and tons of things you have to build your character with from the get-go. I remember, Ernest Adams, who used to write a lot of series on game design for Gamma Sutra back in the day. He talked about that kind of choice paralysis of, okay, you're going to start a game for the first time, here's 5 different pages of character attributes and stats. Before you even know what the game is about, build your character. And I think that's why, for me, I never really got into a lot of the kind of more crunchier CRPGs, because I just want to start a game and go, okay, I begin, now let me build my character, rather than building the character from the onset.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of initial paralysis is a real bugbear for not just me, but I think a lot of designers in the space. I've tried to play the Pathfinder CRPG, the Kingmaker, and because it's based off of Pathfinder, which is a very, very crunchy D&D variant, it gets to the point where you're selecting your feats, and it will give you not just the feat you're picking, but it shows you a whole tree of options that are going to branch off from that. And it's essentially telling you that you need to plan your character now. You need to decide what you can do at level 20 when you're building a character at level 1. And when you've just opened the game, that's a big ask, unless you're already a Pathfinder sicko. There's a game developer I follow, whose work I follow a lot, named Jeff Vogel. He You're nodding, so I think you know who that. Yeah, so
Hmm.
Spiderweb Software. I've been playing their games since the late '90s, and he has a lot of insights on this from essentially making the same types of games for the last 30 plus years. And he wrote a really interesting article about this kind of decision paralysis and how your investment in a character increases over time. Instead and that kind of pre-planning that has to be done as part of developing your character. And I think there are some games which lean way too hard on that. I try to build my games so that you have a small number of options initially, and then they branch out as you become more familiar, and nothing is too like you don't have feat trees in Leviathan or Erebus. You just you advance a level, you get X benefit, and then you get to choose one new thing which your character can do. So you get that nice kind of incremental sense of advancement, but it's not nothing you're doing is completely contingent on everything else, because that kind of interlaced kind of spider. I mean, Path of Exile, classic example of that. I
Hmm.
think, like I've seen I played it. I think I played it for about 30 minutes. Opened the skill tree, and then my brain just blue screened, and I had to go and have a drink of water.
Hmm. That is the reaction for a lot of people. Like if you're not accustomed to Path of Exile, when you first turn on the perk tree for it, and yeah, like for me, I definitely prefer that more like incremental style. Okay, I start this character. Hey, I really like fire magic. Okay, here's the fire magic tree. Okay, maybe this time I prefer firearms. Here's all the firearm perks. What was my? I really enjoy like Grim Dawn in that respect for having kind of like it's kind of laid out more along being more like a linear, but you can decide how far you want to like take each node up. And again, it really comes down to like how the decision making works in your game. And with like Leviathan, and to kind of go back to the idea of like the diceless interactions.
Mm.
When you're thinking about games like this, as we've said at the beginning, the whole point of deterministic versus random, how do you make something? How do you make it interesting when there is no randomness? Because again, like there are 1,000 different ways you can approach this from a design standpoint.
So, and that's a really interesting question, I think, because I follow developers who are moving into a diceless space. Like,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of my influences for the work I'm doing now, they've moved into making games where it is entirely about managing resources rather than rolling dice. Like, you're essentially deciding what you want to spend and when.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't personally choose to do that because I think a little bit of randomness. I prefer to work within that space. For my part, like the dice elements of Leviathan are to play into the themes of the game. So what will you sacrifice to get what you want? You're in a world of entropy and survival where you're having to make these decisions which are going to cost you something. And I think a dice roll would work against that in that specific situation. So there's different ways of doing it. Obviously, like there's games where you've got this kind of spectrum of results off of a dice roll. Like you've got straight up failure, catastrophic. Everything goes wrong. Mixed success. You get a little bit of what you wanted, but maybe not enough, and then you get exactly what you wanted. My problem was actually with the topmost result, just getting what you want with no strings attached, because in those types of games, that was always the most boring result from a roll. Like just getting what you want. There's no drama there. Like the
Mm-hmm.
essence of a story is if you boil it down, it's about someone wanting something, and then something stopping them from getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when it came to the narrative, the storytelling, and handling those kind of threats and challenges outside of here's a guy who wants to kill you, the conversation became much more interesting. Of what will you give up to do this? Will you lose time and then
Mm-hmm.
your objective moves further away? Will you sacrifice your resources? The supplies you would have used to rest during this expedition. Will you allow yourself? Will you exert yourself to get what you want and become fatigued, which will make your next combat more difficult if you get into one. So it became more about managing your costs and feeling that kind of pressure building as you, because the main kind of cycle of Leviathan, at least, is the expedition. So you have the expedition, you go out there, you're going out with a specific goal which you want to
Mm-hmm.
reach, and then it cycles into downtime where you get to relax, you replenish your resources, you build up your community, you blow off some steam, and then it's off to the next expedition. And I wanted that feeling of kind of by the end of an expedition, like I want the players to feel like they're really dragging themselves through it, that they've been through hell and back to get what they want.
Having like the choices that the player knows like what they're giving up. I think that's in like what they're getting, what they're giving up. Like it reminds me a lot of one of the issues I had with like FTL. That a lot of the choices in FTL were just basically, okay, do you take the gun or do you take a first aid kit? And say, okay, I'll take the first aid kit. Oh no, the first aid kit was actually a bomb. It exploded, kill your entire crew. Like, okay, like, sure, I guess that could have happened. And it's very, again, like as we've been talking about, like, I think the player needs to understand at the end of the day what their decision is actually going to be doing. Because one of the things that is killing for a lot of the 4X games, trying to learn them, has been that very much act of, okay, if I build this and I get an entirely different outcome 5 different times, what did I learn from that? Like, how do I, grow as a player going forward?
Yeah, there has to be an underlying logic to what you're doing. There was that tactical 40k game, Mechanicus, which I enjoy a lot because it is, and that's an interesting example actually, because it's a game that leans more on the deterministic side of things, where you were never determining randomly what would happen in a fight. Like everything was, aside from a slight like range in terms of the damage an attack would do, everything was set in stone in terms of what. So it became about a bit like Into the Breach, managing threats rather than anything else, but the wider kind of setting of the missions where you were exploring these rooms, and you would say you would get a little scenario which said like, oh, we found this machine, this ancient machine, what do you want to do to it? And it'd be like, okay, we douse it in incense and say a prayer, or we blow it up, or we try and hack into it. And it almost felt arbitrary because you would never know what the result would be of your action. Like even the thing that felt sensible would sometimes lead to a punitive outcome. And that was a point of criticism because it meant that you weren't able to determine any kind of underlying logic. You weren't able to master the game. Like the only mastery came from recognizing that it is essentially random. And then a lot of the time, the choice becomes in that situation just to not engage with it. And I'm trying to think of a game that did that I just thought of, but like there are these RNG scenarios where you can get deeply punished, and the optimal strategy just becomes to avoid it. Don't engage. Just walk away. Do something else.
It was reminding me a lot. I don't know if you played the game Tharsis from when it was like 5-6 years ago, maybe more than that. Tharis. This was a game built entirely on dice rolls. You're trying to protect a spaceship that's trying to land on a distant planet. So like every turn, you're given randomized events, and like different events will require different amounts of dice or different rolls of the dice. And it was a game that there are people who absolutely love that game, but I was one of the people who I just did not get into it because it ran to that issue for me where, okay, very first turn, you get 7 catastrophic failures. Okay, great. Then I restart the run. Okay, this turn, you get 2 minor failures. Okay, that's great, but why should I play? And again, it goes like we were just saying, like, why should the player commit to playing a game where their choices and their outcomes are just completely out of their control? Like, when it doesn't feel like they're actually doing anything that's impacting the game, it kind of, I think, will drive people away.
Yeah, I mean, I have to imagine that there are players who enjoy the randomness, are able to embrace that entropy. For my own part, I enjoy learning systems and mechanics and mastering systems. So there was an adventure game that came out quite a few years ago now called Gods Will Be Watching, and it was like a point and click adventure, except the outcomes of your actions were randomized, so you would never know what the objectively correct thing was to do in a situation. So I remember the intro level was a hostage scenario on a spaceship, and you would have to, you were deciding who to talk to, what you were doing, but there was never kind of a guaranteed outcome of any of your actions. And I found that no matter what I did, people would just die. Like I kept on losing the scenario over and over again, and I never got past that bit. because I just couldn't see how I could kind of engage with a system that just seemed to be like it was just, real life is random enough.
Yeah.
I don't need a video game punishing me with the bewildering vicissitudes of modern life.
Hmm. I think with that as an interesting question, I want to ask you: did you ever play the game King of Dragon Pass from back in the day?
No, but I know it by reputation.
Yes. What made that game, I think, such a standout was that it went for more like almost like narrative decision making. It was kind of like you had your different advisors, and they would each tell you different things, saying, "Okay, maybe this turn, we need more food." But the military was like, "No, we need to go out and build more armies." So it was a case where instead of the player being told exactly, "Okay, I need X amount of food," or "I need X amount of this," it kind of went for more almost like of a vibe. Okay, your people are maybe kind of needing some food. Well, I don't know how much food, but I'll try giving them 600 food this time, or 1,000 food. Well, maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. And again, it had that same as you were just describing, where, okay, I'm not being told exactly what I need. And there are people who, again, they love that idea, that kind of more like narrative based of decision making. But for me, it just kind of ran into that same issue, like I said with a lot of the 4X games, of, okay, if I do X, Y, and Z and I get 3 complete different outcomes each time I do it, how am I learning this game? Like, again, I think I'm definitely more like you in terms of loving like the mechanics and the system. So I'll figure out, okay, how do I make this all work to my advantage? And again, it's that kind of challenge of who are you designing this game for?
Yeah, I mean, I was the kid who kept bookmarks in Choose Your Own Adventure books. Like my copy of Warlock on Firetop Mountain had like 500 dog ears by the time I was done with it, because I would run it. I would, go to page 63. Oh, I didn't like that. Okay, go back. My finger was still on the page.
Yep.
Do over. And something like that, that kind of situation, all it would encourage me to do is have like 16 different quick saves, and then just keep on rolling the game back until I could either learn the logic of the outcomes or find the outcome that I wanted. And I think for me, like, because I'm very dogmatic about how I engage with a video game. Like, I have to engage with it on its own terms, even if I don't enjoy those terms. So in a way, I make my own life more difficult. But in that kind of situation where I know I'm working against the intent of the designer, like, I don't feel good about that, and it makes me want to disengage from the work, because I'm just kind of saying, thinking, I'm not the target audience for this. Like, I'm not doing the developer, the creator, the creative vision. I'm not doing them their due diligence by engaging with this the way I'm engaging. And I know that's completely orthogonal to what a lot of, because some people, they love, they mod games all over the place. They'll put like 1,500 mods in Skyrim to make it a completely different video game, and I always found that very difficult to do because of this little nagging voice in the back of my head that would say, "You're not doing it right."
Yep. And yeah, it's a really good point about that. I think I'm the same way. Like, unless I'm playing a conversion mod where I'm playing someone else's creation within that game, I rather just try and understand like the developer's approach. Again, it's why I analyze so many games here on the channel, where I'm trying to figure out what was the intent of the developer and did they succeed, yes or no. And again, like playing mods that try to fix that kind of gets in the way of it. But it is that kind of challenge of what is the intent of these systems? Because you'll have games where it just feels like the developer just hated you, and like everything is out to get you. And again, there are people who love that level of challenge, but there are also people who they want to play a game that it feels like, there is that light at the end of the tunnel, that if I learn this, I can win. Versus I take 2 steps forward, I get hit by like 27 baseball bats, and now I'm dead.
No, I mean, I think it kind of leads into something I think about a lot, which is that friction is really important to game design for me. Like, like I said, I've been playing like the original Baldur's Gate since it came out in 1998. Like, I've got a save which I go back to every now and then, just because it's almost like self-soothing behavior at this point. Is just going into a space which I am literally 100% familiar with. But as a game designer, I look at the game and I go, well, a lot of these systems and mechanics don't make sense, really. Like, it's all kind of arbitrary. So I've installed mods to change that, or I've written I've rewritten the code of the game to alter things that, if I was going to design a rule, this is the way I would do it. So let's put that in. But then what I would find is that would elide the friction inherent in the game to the point where I would actually lose interest. Like those little points, those little bristles of frustration. It's a little kind of frisson of cortisol or excitement, which would actually keep me engaged. And having an experience which is completely smoothed off, it's just no sharp corners at all, in its own way, can be quite anodyne, like quite uninteresting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like when the game basically just gives you everything. Again, then it just becomes its own like nightmare of, okay, there's no challenge, there's no decision making. The game just essentially plays itself. Then why am I here? Like, what's my role in it?
Because then you've hit the polar opposite of my decisions don't matter. Instead of, okay, anything I can do can randomly fail, it's everything I do succeeds to the maximum extent, and as a result, it doesn't really matter what I do. Like I'm just making decisions, and then I get to the end anyway without any kind of engaging my brain or thinking or experiencing any kind of challenge. And I think as mammals, as animals, we crave stimulation and challenge. Like we want those problem-solving parts of our brains to be tickled. And I think it's why, tactical games, even when like the 4X and the strategic space was going, down, like for a long time, Civ was basically the only strategic game in the mainstream, and CRPGs disappeared completely for about 15 years. Those things have come back because people actually like having that little brain tickle of kind of, oh, this is tricky. Like I need to switch on. I need to figure this out.
Yeah. And again, there are people who will want that kind of, mind turn off, just, again, watch number go up. And again, there is a market and appeal for that. We have the whole idle genre, I think, would be proof of that. But again, it goes back to like who you're designing your game for. With kind of like the appeal of like making like an idle game. Like again, like as I just said, there are people who love that kind of, turn the brain off, that kind of approach. In terms of like thinking about a market and an audience, again, like whether you're making a tabletop game, a computer game, or anything else, it's something that you have to consider as a developer. So like for like you and your particular style, like what do you think about in terms of like the market or like the consumer, people who will want to play your games?
Well, I'm kind of in a lucky and maybe not so lucky position as a designer, which is I have a full-time job. Like I have to, I work full-time to support my family, and as a result, like my design work isn't my primary source of income, so I can afford to be an auteur and just make the game that I feel like making. And if people like it, then brilliant. I found someone who likes the same kind of things I like. They've gotten invested and they've paid me money for the pleasure, and it's a good feeling. It's validating, but it's ultimately not why I'm making the games. Like I make them because it's something I enjoy doing. I think I made enough off of Erebus to recoup what I spent publishing it, and that was about it. And I'm perfectly happy with that. It's it is a tricky space because building something more mainstream, so looking at what kind of tabletop games are more popular, I would probably incorporate design that I'm not actually really a fan of. Like like I said before, like some one designer I kind of follow has been talking about how he's gotten more and more interested in diceless games as time has gone on. But in one of his recent projects, he decided he had to implement dice rolling because it's the expectation of the genre. Like players want to roll the math rocks because it's the thing you do. So there are those kind of paeans to design which have to be, if I was serious about doing this as a full-time job, which is incredibly challenging in this economy, I would probably have to make a lot more compromises in terms of what I do.
And it's that challenge, especially when you're starting out, in terms of who you're trying to reach as a designer. Because ultimately, like one of the things I've taught a lot about, especially in the last like 6 months to a year, has been sustainability. And part of that is understanding who you're targeting with your games. Because if you've been targeting, let's say, casual gamers, and your next game is a super hardcore, Darkest Dungeon times 10 experience, you just alienate everyone who's been playing your games up until that point.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm always going to work within a specific niche, and it is. I think one interesting thing that I see happen is the zeitgeist advances in such a way that a project I'm working on suddenly becomes like a focal point for my community. Like there was a point where everyone was going nuts about mecha RPGs, and oh look, here I've got a work in progress that's a mech game. I should probably put a bit more focus into that. And I think that's about as far as my work has gone in terms of finding an audience, is kind of looking at where things are in terms of what people are interested in, what's being discussed, and then focusing within that space. Erebus was released quite shortly after Lancer, which is was a pretty big deal in the like it's probably one of the more successful tabletop games that isn't Dungeons and Dragons, and that was a kind of a high concept like Mud and Lasers mecha game. And off the back, like the release was so close, and some of the systems were so similar that I almost worried that people would accuse me of plagiarism. But what had happened is I'd started writing my game based off of a rule set which had they shared DNA basically, but I think there's a point where sometimes you can end up almost falling on the same idea at the same time as someone else, and I mean it's like the ants and a Bug's Life dilemma, like both two animated movie studios releasing a movie about being ants in the same kind of 6 month window. Like, did someone rip someone off? What's going on there?
I guess like one final question about, I guess like deterministic versus random in terms of like tactical. We mentioned, of course, XCOM several times in this cast, and one of the more interesting things that they did in XCOM, I'm trying to remember, there's older tactical games that did this, was they had different options that were either 100% random or purely deterministic. Like in XCOM 2, for example, you had like the like that little like drone that you could send out that would do a guaranteed 1 point of damage. And one of the things I talked about in previous like design posts and videos was about how much power there is when you have deterministic in a randomized world. So again, like if we're playing a normal game, 1 point of damage means nothing. Wow, I can shoot this guy for 87 points with my rifle or 1 point with a pistol. But if you're playing a game where you can guarantee 1 or 2 more points of damage, that's huge. You can completely say, this guy's my oldest super fancy cover, I have a 20% chance to hit. Nope. 1 point. Or as anyone who's played XCOM or even a Showgunners, just throw grenades. Grenades, there's no to hit chance with a grenade landing next to someone. So the question I wanted to throw at you is, with like weighting different options in terms of deterministic versus randomized in like any kind of game, like what do you think about that in terms of like having like that power? Like, do you want to have like deterministic options in a randomized game, or randomized options in a deterministic game, or do you feel like it's like a lot of a harder balance when you're throwing both in at the same time?
I think it ultimately depends on the goal of the game. So I think with XCOM 2 as the example, like those deterministic options are, like you say, they're excellent for kill confirms. They're for threat management. Basically, you know exactly how much damage this specific option is going to do. You know that's going to take someone off the board when the next turn comes around. Personally, I love that type of design. It's something I stole for Erebus. So the core kind of attack system, like using a weapon, there was always a chance you would miss. But if you were using a grenade or a rocket launcher or a machine that rips open a time rift, the thing would happen. I think where where the management is important is making sure those options aren't always available, so they consume a resource, or they take away an opportunity that you would have had otherwise. So no, I'm a big fan of that type of design. I think having deterministic options in a random system is always a good idea, because it gives the player something they can control and develop that mastery of, okay, this guy has 3 hit points left. Like, I have an attack which will guarantee to do 3. So I know right now that I can take this guy out, and because when it comes down to the pure math of it, like each enemy on the board, they're a set amount of threat of damage. This guy's on here. I know that he's got a plasma rifle. It does 4 to 6 points of damage. That's potentially going to happen to one of my guys. I need to take that damage off the board before it kills someone. So I think it offers a very satisfying dimension to tactical play if there's a lot of randomness that's otherwise in the mix. Like I think it's how the XCOM remakes ameliorate a lot of the more frustrating randomness in their design, because you know that there's going to be something you can do which will have a guaranteed effect. Like XCOM 2, like the Ranger with their sword, like if I really want to take a risk, I can have my guy run in and stab a guy. It's going to put him completely out of position, and if he sets off another group of enemies, he's probably going to get blown up. But I know that right now I can kill that one guy.
Or another example that I like is when you have a skill that breaks Overwatch. That, okay, yes, enemy set for Overwatch, where I have, the super fast run. Or I can, suppress an enemy. Or another thing that people love in the XCOM remakes was using flashbangs. And just throw like 10 flashbangs into the enemy, and they just move everyone up because they can't see you beyond like one square. And yeah, I think that's a really good point when you have, like, as you said, like threat mitigation, threat management is such a very important part of tactical design. Yes, this enemy, like, you can have battles be very different based on what your options are. I don't know if you saw the game Kingsvein from developer Rad Codex.
Yes, I've seen Kingsvein, yeah.
That I thought did a really interesting job of having skills. I think this is like going to be like my final point for one of my final points for these for the cast is that for me I like decisions that they feel broken and overpowered in the right moment. That if you have a power to like push and pull an enemy, okay, if you're in a wide open field, wow, who cares? But let's say there's pits around, or spike walls, or spike traps. Suddenly, being able to push an enemy 5 squares across 5 different spike pits feels very important, or it feels really gray and broken. It again goes with the Cerulean example that I mentioned earlier. But that's just one case. It's not a case where one thing is going to be the best thing. It's you have 10 overpowered strategies that all have their moment in the sun. So, which one do you feel like doing, or which one do you think works best for the situation? I think that to me is where it gets more interesting to play, as opposed to just saying, okay, ice is the best skill in the entire game. Everyone just use ice spike and ice freeze and all that.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and it's like a big design issue in a lot of older tabletop games is action economy. Because it turns out being able to do more things on your turn is objectively the best thing you can have.
Yep.
And a lot of games have figured out ways to work around that. But at the end of the day, like being able to do more things is always better. Like, XCOM 2012, going back to a classic example, like I can't think of many situations where I would not want to take the ability that lets you shoot twice on the same turn, because 2 shots is potentially 2 kills. Giving or it's softening up an enemy for someone else to kill. Like adds a huge advantage, and I think there's certain levers you just can't give the players to pull. Like now, I think I would definitely agree that what you want is narrow strategies which are highly effective when their niche is exposed, because it lets a player feel powerful, but it also lets them feel like a very smart boy. For recognizing the situation where they're going to be able to break this fight over their knee by pushing a guy through 5 spike traps or off of a skyscraper.
Alright, so I think I'm just about out of design questions. I guess for me, I just have a few questions for you in terms of like what you're working on and like how things are coming along. So before we do that, anything else regarding tactical design, tabletop design, anything design related that we didn't touch on that you would like to talk about?
Just gonna have a quick look here. I mean, there was like one interesting tension I find is that kind of distinction between simulation and gamism kind of design. So, going back to the drawing deep from this well, apparently here is original XCOM versus the remakes. Like there was a greater emphasis on attempting to model kind of a real situation. So obviously a human being could shoot a gun and then walk somewhere. Like there's nothing stopping a human from physically doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, when they did the Firaxis ones, they looked more at kind of board game design, which is obviously a big part of Firaxis, is they look at gamifying things. Like the Civ games have always been very abstract when it took, like they're not actually modeling the development of civilization. They are giving you a game to play, and you've got little tokens and little men that you move around. And when they did the XCOM games in 2012, they decided, no, we're going to lean on the board game side of things. You've got 2 action pips, and you're only allowed to use one of those to do an attack because that's how the game is balanced. And it is a really interesting tension for me as a designer, is figuring out where I want things to feel more real versus where I want them to be more of a game. Because ultimately, the game is what will feel better. Like the mechanics, most mechanics in games don't reflect real life, and they don't try to, because actually modeling real life can be quite dull.
And I think that's a really good point what you just said there about kind of the gaminess versus the simulation style of tactical design. Like, here's like my line in the sand that I draw, the hill that I will die on. I want to be able to either move and attack or attack and move. Like I can feel like the spike going into my brain anytime if I have 2 actions and I shoot first and it cancels the move. Because I know again why developers do that from a balancing standpoint, but it just drives me crazy in games that have that option.
That's so interesting, because that's actually a hill that I have died on with some of my games, is that once you've committed to an offensive action, you can't reposition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's from a gamer's perspective of, you are choosing, this is where you are set up, like you are committing to your position, and you have to deal with the consequences of doing that. So that is coming at it completely from the opposite direction.
I think that's also again why I love like the Mario plus Rapids, because they let you they just give you like any combination of your like 2 or 3 actions. You want run, attack, jump, attack, move, jump, attack, whatever you want, do it.
And it's also like attack rolls in games. Like that's a really interesting one, and it's one that has been litigated a lot in the RPG space, because ultimately having an option for your turn where you roll a die and potentially nothing happens at all is not good game design. Like, it's essentially telling it, especially in like D&D, in something like Baldur's Gate 3 where you're controlling a whole party, you're fine. Like, one guy whiffs, you've got 2 more guys you can use to make an attack. If you are only controlling 1 player and there's 6 other players, and it's going to be like 20 minutes before your turn comes back round, if you've just spent your turn rolling a die and then nothing happening, that's not very interesting. So one thing I did with Leviathan with the fixed outputs was, it's impossible for an attack to fail. You will always deal damage unless the other character does something to mitigate that. So they spend a resource to move or to reposition or to block it, which I think creates a very different dynamic, but not one that necessarily reflects reality. Like, you've got a bow and arrow, you fire it at someone, sometimes the arrow will just miss. But when you put that into a game, the conversation becomes a bit more fraught, because in that case you maybe don't want to model reality, you want to model an interesting situation.
Yep, and again, kind of goes to what we were saying a few minutes ago about when you have these purely like deterministic actions in a randomized setting, that like, how does the player's decision making understand that? With, okay, if I do this, it's a 1 in 5 chance it will work, versus if I do this is a 100% chance it's going to work. But let's say this 100% chance is only 2 points of damage versus 8 to 10 damage with this one. Well, which one do I do? Because again, there's like 10,000 variables I can go into that very simple statement.
Yeah, and then you're in the wonderful space of gambling again, and you get that little frisson of excitement of, oh, I'm gonna take the gamble. I'm gonna do the thing that might not work.
I guess, like, again, like, since we're recording this, we can't see any like user responses. But for people watching this, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on? Do you prefer the more board game or the gamifying of tactics, or do you like more of the simulation style? Because I know people I've been told to try the Battletech game that came out from a few years ago. I haven't had a chance to play that one yet, and I think that one went for more of a simulation style. And again, it's really two very different forms of design. Because as we said, the advantage of gamifying is that it makes things very easy to understand. If I can only move and attack, that's it. Those are my two options. There's no, as you said, like the original XCOM or well I'm playing with X Pirates. It's not like I can go move, attack, move, attack, attack, move, attack. No, my turns are very linear in that respect. But again, with the simulation side, you get far more options, but that can also bog things down. Because again, as we said with the original XCOM, the nightmare of moving 16 characters across a map, one unit at a time, can drive anyone mad.
No, exactly, and it's finding that balance. I think a lot of the time because there's good there's advantages to both schools of design. I don't think you have to fully
Mm-hmm.
put yourself in one camp or the other. You can take a little bit from everything. But I think people will generally fall on one side or the other when it comes down to a certain kind of there's like you said there's a line in the sand for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people. Um, I'm like as a designer, I just can't. And well, unmedicated ADHD is probably a factor, but I can't stand anything that bogs a game down. Like I need things to be linear and quick and impactful, and have that, like I said, that feeling of like parts clicking together
Mm-hmm.
as you execute.
All right, I think that is just about all of my questions. We were originally going to set this for an hour, and we're almost knocking on two. So I think we can certainly round this. But again, if you're free in the future, Max, so this was a great conversation. I'd love to talk more about tactical design with you in the future.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. I'd love that.
All right. So to wrap things up for our cast, I guess a little bit more about what's going on with you. So in terms of Leviathan, to go back to the store page for a second, so it is available to download right now. You said that's kind of like almost like a spotlight or a preview for like the main game at the moment. Do you have
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
okay? Do you have any like tentative plans or when like 1.0 will be done for it?
So it's I essentially have a complete game at this point. So the document that's available on the itch page is playable from start to finish. Like you could make a character
Mhm.
and run them from first level through to the end. The main development area right now is GM tools, just because I believe in having a robust toolkit for people to run the game. So,
Mhm.
it's there, it's functional. It doesn't have a lot of support for a campaign yet. My work schedule is pretty spotty at the moment, just because of, like I said, working full time. But I would hope to have this a full release candidate before the end of the year, God willing.
All right. And you said earlier you have other projects like in the fires right now. Anything else that you can like tease people listening to us in terms of what else you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one project I've come back to and I've been working towards an initial release candidate has been Talanaut, which is a Evangelion inspired mecha game. So it's focused on uh, these kind of big dramatic boss battles. It's not like mob combat. You have a team of players. One takes on the role of the ops director, who is directing and kind of assisting the team who are in their mechs, and they're fighting huge occult monsters. Um, and there's with the ever-present risk of your mech eating you, and that's the main way you lose a character in that game. I've got a couple of more tentative projects. I've got a 2-page preview together for Voltigeur, which is I think of it as a Strand game, so in the same vein as like Death Stranding, where it's not so much about conflict and destroying things as it is about connecting things. So it's about a team of explorers reconnecting the kind of the scattered remnants of humanity across a dark galaxy. Um, it's an interesting space on that one, but it's very much inspired by the book How Hard to Be a God,
Okay.
um, by the Strugatsky brothers. But it's I suppose the more probably the more accessible reference would be the Prime Directive in Star Trek. So the idea that you're connecting with these groups, but you can't you ideally don't want to influence them. Like you're not there to become overlords and tell people how to live their lives, because ultimately you are superior to the people you're engaging with. Like you have the technology, you have training, you have conditioning far beyond any kind of human norm. So the conflict in the game is more about not going over the top and off piste and just completely taking over a situation and causing collateral damage.
All right. Sounds very interesting. So, Again, Max, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you tonight. Before we go, any final thoughts? And you like to kind of like take us out on?
I don't think so. No, I mean it's been a real pleasure having this chat. I don't get a lot of opportunities to get into the weeds of design chat, so no, I just really appreciate the chance to get on here and have a talk.
All right, great. And again, thank you so much for reaching out.
Thanks very much.
All right. So, with that, before I end things for tonight, do you have anything social media wise you would like to mention for people to follow you? I'll include a link to the itch page down below for people watching this, of course.
Yeah, so I'm on Blue Sky primarily. I do have technically a Twitter account, but I haven't touched it since everything.
Yeah.
So that is the same as my itch page. So Menoetian, menoetian.itch.io. I am trying to post more just in terms of general things that interest me, and I'm going to try and share more of my design thoughts as well in that space. Otherwise, yeah, it's that in my itch page, basically.
Awesome. All right. So, for people watching us right now, we're going to wrap things up for this conversation. So, if you're a fan of tabletop RPGs, be sure to check out Max's page. Like I said, there'll be a link to that down below. And thank you everybody for watching. If you're new, do the YouTubing stuff, buy all the copies of my books. Be sure to follow me everywhere. And as I said, if you are a developer working on a game and want to come on to talk about it, or just game design, please reach out. So again, Max, thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck with Leviathan and your other projects.
Thanks, Josh.
All right. So with that said, everyone, come back for discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games. Until our next check, have a great night.